You do not hear the door lock behind you, not the first time. You are too focused on the way the corridor narrows, the way the world seems to tighten around your ribs, as if preparing to squeeze you out of yourself. The nurse walking ahead of you does not look back. She does not need to. You are already inside, and once a woman steps over this threshold, her intentions no longer matter. The walls know it. The staff knows it. And somewhere, miles away, the man who signed the form that delivered you here knows it too. He is eating dinner, perhaps, or reading a newspaper, or pretending not to listen to the faint echo of your name still drifting through his house like a ghost he has banished. For now you still remember who you are, but the institution has time, it has patience, and it has the force of law. That is the part no one warns you about. Not the cold floors or the isolation cells, not the chemical restraints or the constant surveillance, not the prayers recited as punishment or the endless hours folding sheets until your fingers ache. No. What no one warns you is that every degrading thing that will happen to you in this place is legal, institutional, sanitized by signatures and seals, sanitized by the belief that a man, by virtue of being a husband, possesses an authority over the boundaries of his wife's mind. You walk deeper into the building, and for a moment the gas lamps flicker above your head. You realize how impossibly quiet everything is, how the air seems thick with the silence of women who learned long ago that protesting only gives them more reason to tighten the straps. Somewhere a metal bed frame creaks. Somewhere else a voice cries out and is swallowed by the walls. The corridor bends. The nurse's shoes click sharply, and you begin to understand the truth. You have not been brought here to be cured. You have been brought here to be forgotten. Only now does the narrative widen enough for us to see the system that made this moment possible, the machinery behind one man's signature. In 19th century Britain, the asylum system was expanding faster than almost any other institution, fueled by a blend of moral panic, Victorian obsession with female obedience, and legal frameworks that placed a woman's autonomy below that of her husband, father, or brother. The madness feared by the authorities was rarely the kind born of hallucinations or delusion. It was the madness of non-compliance, the madness of speaking too loudly, disagreeing too sharply, resisting too firmly. Some women were confined for postnatal depression long before it had a name, others for grief that lasted longer than a husband deemed acceptable, others still for simply being inconvenient, a wife who refused her marital duties, a wife who spoke her mind too freely, a wife who inherited money her husband wanted control over. The asylum became not just a place of treatment, but a tool of domestic discipline, a courtroom where only one side was ever invited to speak. The legal mechanism that underpinned this entire system was shockingly simple. Under certain lunacy laws of the time, a husband could have his wife admitted to an asylum if two doctors agreed she was of unsound mind. And those doctors, often overworked, underpaid, and eager to maintain relationships with influential men, rarely hesitated to validate whatever narrative a husband presented. If he told them she was hysterical, they nodded. If he told them she was melancholic, they nodded again. If he claimed she had threatened him, even in self-defense, that alone could be interpreted as proof of instability. The wife's testimony carried no legal weight. Her denial could be seen as further evidence of madness. Her composure could be labeled manipulative. Her tears could be framed as instability. The system was constructed so that every defense she offered became a rung in the staircase, leading down into institutional darkness. But the law was only the first step. The second was the environment that greeted her once she arrived, a place designed not to heal but to reshape, to press a woman into the mold of submission until she fit whatever shape society demanded. These asylums presented themselves as medical institutions, but their practices straddled the boundary between healthcare and punishment. Women were stripped of their clothes, their jewelry, their letters, even their hair in some cases. Their identities were reduced to entries in ledgers, details recorded clinically, patient number, supposed symptoms, date of arrival. The clothes they were given were coarse, intentionally dehumanizing, meant to remind them of their position. Their days were controlled down to the minute, when to eat, when to sleep, when to pray, when to speak. They were supervised constantly, even during the most intimate moments of washing or dressing. Privacy became a relic of the past. They rarely learned the names of the staff. They were called patients, always patients, as if the label itself carried enough truth to erase everything they had ever been before. The women quickly learned that the institution responded not to truth, but to compliance. The quiet ones were rewarded. The obedient ones were trusted with small privileges. The ones who protested, who asked questions, demanded explanations, begged for letters to be sent to their families, were often punished, solitary, confinement, cold baths, physical restraint, sedation. A husband might have forgotten his wife the minute she was locked away, but the walls remembered every deviation from the behavior expected of a proper woman. What made the system particularly brutal was the way it weaponized the assumption of female fragility. Victorian society believed women were naturally unstable, naturally emotional, naturally prone to mental collapse. So when a woman expressed distress inside the asylum, it was used as further evidence that she belonged there. If she cried, they said she was hysterical. If she went silent, they said she was dissociated. If she grew angry, they said she was dangerous. There was no correct emotional response that might prove her sanity because the system was designed to invalidate her existence at every turn. Meanwhile, husbands were encouraged by law and by custom to view commitment as a tool of household management. Newspapers of the era published cautionary tales about disobedient wives, about women who challenged their husband's authority, about the supposed dangers of letting female independence grow unchecked. The asylum was framed as a desperate last resort for men whose wives had become burdens. It was described as an act of protection, a way to shield a fragile woman from the dangers of her own mind. And because these narratives came wrapped in the language of morality and medical progress, society accepted them with a disturbing lack of scrutiny. Yet beneath the surface of respectability, something darker churned. There were women who entered these institutions sane and left broken, or who never left at all. Their families were told they had deteriorated, that their illness had deepened, that their delusions made them unfit for the outside world. But if you walked through certain corridors, if you listened at certain doors, you would hear the truth. Women whispering their names in the dark so they would not forget them. Women reciting prayers because the rhythm kept their memories intact. Women stitching hidden symbols into their uniforms so they could recognize one another in a place designed to erase individuality. And occasionally, women who wrote letters that never left the building, detailing every cruelty, every injustice, every small indignity that slowly carved away at their identities until only shadows remain. The first time you hear of a woman who fought back, really fought, it is not in a courtroom or a newspaper, but in the whispered mythology of the ward, spoken in snatches between bed checks, and you cling to her story because it suggests that the walls are not invincible, that somewhere beyond your current reality, the law that trapped you here can be turned against itself, even if only partially. Her name, as it circulates among the women, is often softened or changed for safety, so let us call her Eleanor. Eleanor did something almost no one else dared to do. She managed to make her confinement visible to the outside world in a way that could not be easily explained away as madness. Her husband had her committed after she challenged his control over an inheritance she had brought into the marriage, money he believed should be his by right. He told the doctors she was obsessed, unstable, prone to flights of paranoia about her finances. He mentioned, with carefully deployed sorrow, that she had accused him of manipulation, even of cruelty. The doctors, reading from the script the system had handed them, found this entirely plausible. They signed the papers. The asylum opened its doors. Eleanor entered believing there had been some terrible mistake that would surely be cleared up once someone sensible learned the truth. Weeks passed, then months. Her letters home went unanswered. Her requests to speak with a solicitor were brushed aside. Her protests were interpreted as symptoms. She was told repeatedly that acceptance was the first step toward recovery, that if she would only stop insisting on her own version of events, things would improve. Many women broke under that pressure. Eleanor bent instead. She learned the art of strategic silence. She watched which nurses were cruel and which were merely tired. She noted the rhythms of the ward, who came and went, which doors were left unlocked when the post arrived. She calmed her hands and eyes long enough to convince the staff that she was improving. Only then, in carefully chosen moments of apparent vulnerability, did she begin to speak again, not about herself but about the others. She described women who seemed clearly sane, women who had been confined decades ago for so-called moral offenses and never reassessed. She asked in a voice lined with concern rather than anger whether it might be a good idea in this enlightened age to review some of these cases. A young doctor, fresh from medical school and full of modern theories, listened. He did not release her. He did, however, mention her observations in a lecture. A journalist happened to be present. The article that followed did not name Eleanor, of course, but it did something the law had not anticipated. It planted the idea that the asylum could be misused, that the signatures which sealed a woman's fate were sometimes weighted more heavily by convenience than by genuine illness. Once that possibility entered public discourse, other stories began to surface. A clergyman confided that a parishioner had confessed regret over sending his wife away for nothing more than religious fervor that did not match his own. A former asylum attendant, now dying, told a nephew that many of the women behind those doors were no madder than their neighbors, just more troublesome. A solicitor admitted that he had been pressured to advise a client that institutionalization was the only respectable option for dealing with a scandal. Tiny admissions, each seemingly isolated, but together they formed a crack in the facade of unquestioned legitimacy. Still, the law did not crumble overnight. Its defenders argued that for every Eleanor, there were genuine cases of mental illness that needed secure care, that to reform the process too radically would endanger both patients and the public. They pointed to improvements in treatment, the introduction of new classifications, the presence of inspectors. They spoke as if the system's only problem was the occasional misapplication, a flaw of execution rather than design. Yet the fundamental imbalance remained, the ease with which a man could begin the process compared with the near impossibility for a woman to reverse it. In legal theory, safeguards existed: 2 medical opinions, periodic reviews, the possibility, at least on paper, of discharge. In practice, those mechanisms often functioned less as protections and more as rituals that reassured the public while leaving the underlying power dynamics intact. Doctors were not impartial assessors. They were products of the same culture that believed deeply in male authority and female emotional weakness. Judges, when involved, were more likely to side with the stability of the household than the chaotic prospect of a wife accusing her husband of misuse of power. And society at large had a vested interest in believing that women who caused trouble could be safely categorized as unwell. The alternative, that perfectly sane women were being imprisoned in medical language for stepping outside their assigned roles, was too destabilizing to contemplate for long. Think for a moment about the kinds of behavior that could be pathologized into justification for commitment. A woman grieving too long after the loss of a child. A woman reading certain books and forming opinions unflattering to her husband. A woman who refused to stay silent about infidelity. A woman who expressed sexual desire in ways that did not conform to her husband's expectations. Each of these could be woven into a narrative of instability. Each could be adorned with clinical-sounding terms that made them seem less like disagreements or personal struggles and more like symptoms of a diagnosable condition. Once written down in a doctor's neat handwriting, those descriptions took on an aura of objectivity that was very difficult to challenge. The law, in theory, was neutral. The ink it relied on was not. And so women disappeared, not in dramatic midnight arrests, but in carriage rides to quiet places where their husbands assured the neighbors they would receive the best possible care. Inside those quiet places, the language of treatment often disguised what was essentially domestic punishment outsourced to an institution. Cold baths were said to calm nerves. Isolation rooms were justified as necessary to prevent self-harm. Denial of correspondence was framed as protection from overstimulation. Even forced feeding, in cases where women refused food as a last act of resistance, was described as a life-saving measure rather than a violent invasion. Every intervention had a rationale that sounded reasonable when recited in a committee room. Few of the men drafting reports ever sat in those cold baths, heard the bolts slide on those isolation doors, or felt the bruising grip of orderlies applying restraints. For the women subjected to them, the message was clear. The law does not see you as a person negotiating intolerable conditions. It sees you as a malfunctioning object to be fixed or contained. There were eventually voices within the legal and medical professions who began to question this, often prompted by cases so egregious they could not be fully explained away. A particularly articulate former patient smuggled out a memoir. A sympathetic alienist, confronted with a woman whose only apparent delusion was insisting on her right to attend political meetings, wrote a report more critical of her husband than of her. A judge, hearing a rare appeal, remarked in his notes that the statute gave husbands a terrifying reach over the liberty of those they wed. These moments did not instantly dismantle the system, but they provided language that critics could seize upon. Campaigners for women's rights started to include asylum laws in their list of grievances, alongside property inequality and lack of suffrage. They argued that no woman could be considered truly free while the threat of medicalized imprisonment hung over any act of defiance. Pamphlets were printed, public meetings were held, questions were raised in Parliament about oversight and consent. And yet, even as reforms were tentatively proposed, the lived reality inside many asylums changed only gradually. Laws lagged behind outrage. Inspections were announced in advance, giving institutions time to hide their worst practices. Administrators learned to speak the language of modern psychiatry while maintaining older, more punitive habits behind closed doors. Women continued to be admitted on the strength of a husband's complaint, a doctor's brief examination, a magistrate's signature. The crucial difference was that now, somewhere beyond the walls, a counter-narrative was beginning to form, one that named the system itself as a kind of madness. But for you, walking those corridors, counting the bolts on the doors and the cracks in the ceiling, that shift is invisible. All you know is that there was a time you could leave your house without fearing you might never return, and that time has ended. It ended officially when a pen touched paper and your husband's hand wrote his name underneath a statement about your mind. There comes a point, weeks or months or years into your confinement, when time becomes a fogged mirror, and you can no longer tell whether the world beyond the gates remembers you or not. You hear staff speak of the outside as though it were a distant country, whose language you no longer speak, and perhaps they are right. Letters you write with shaking hands are never delivered. Appeals you attempt to file vanish into drawers. Even your name begins to feel provisional, something that can be taken or replaced depending on who holds authority over you. The institution demands repetition of its routines until you begin to move through them automatically, your body remembering the steps long after your mind has grown too tired to resist. And somewhere beyond these walls, your husband moves on with his life, as though your removal were merely the resolution of an inconvenience. The law allowed this. More than that, it endorsed it, and the longer you remain inside, the clearer it becomes that this system was designed not to treat illness, but to absorb dissent, to turn wives into patients, and patients into silence. You learn the stories of the other women in whispers, exchanged like contraband during laundry duty, or in the few moments before lights out when the nurses are distracted. Many of them share a pattern so precise it seems scripted. A husband displeased by a wife's independence, a doctor consulted, a certificate issued, a carriage ordered. One woman was admitted after challenging her husband's decision to move the family to another city, her objection interpreted as mania. Another arrived because she read books he deemed inappropriate, a third because she struggled with childbirth and was too slow to recover, her grief reframed as melancholia requiring confinement. The staff label these histories troublesome, exaggerated, emotional. But the women recognize themselves in each other's stories, and that recognition becomes a quiet rebellion in itself. It is difficult to erase someone entirely when she sees her own reflection multiplied around her. The staff, for the most part, operate within a hierarchy that discourages curiosity. Nurses are trained to obey orders, not question diagnoses. Orderlies enforce discipline with the mechanical confidence of men who believe they are maintaining order rather than perpetuating harm. Doctors rotate through wards with the detached professionalism of men who trust the law more than they trust their patients, yet even among them, cracks occasionally appear. A matron who has served for decades confides that she once saw a woman committed after accusing her husband of violence. A junior doctor admits in a moment of exhaustion that he sometimes cannot distinguish between legitimate symptoms and the behaviors of women pushed into despair by confinement. These murmurs rarely lead to immediate change, but they accumulate, forming an undercurrent of doubt that becomes harder to ignore as the century progresses. Meanwhile, the outside world begins to shift in ways you can sense only dimly at first, like distant thunder that has not yet reached your sky. Newspapers report on scandals in other institutions, abandoned children, overcrowded wards, unexplained injuries. Reformers publish pamphlets questioning the morality of a system that allows men to imprison their wives with little scrutiny. Women's rights groups, still fighting for suffrage, add asylum reform to their list of demands. They argue that no nation can claim moral progress while permitting husbands to wield such power unchecked. In Parliament, debates flicker into existence only to be extinguished again, drowned out by other priorities. Yet each small flare leaves behind a trace of heat, a growing awareness that something in the asylum system is profoundly misaligned with the ideals of justice the country claims to uphold. For the women inside, however, these developments might as well be happening on the moon. What they experience daily is stripped of political nuance and reduced instead to the brutal intimacy of control, morning inspections, forced labor disguised as therapeutic occupation, the cold weight of a nurse's hand on the back of your neck steering you towards obedience. punishments shaped not to wound the body, but to bend the spirit. Hours in isolation, meals withheld, privileges revoked for the slightest infraction, and always the reminder that your release depends not on your truth, but on your compliance. You are told that recovery means aligning yourself with the expectations of the men who placed you here. Recovery means gratitude. Recovery means silence. Some women internalize these lessons so deeply that they become unrecognizable to themselves. Others resist for as long as they can, clinging to fragments of identity that refuse to dissolve. A few become legends within the ward, the ones who escaped, the ones who confronted a doctor publicly, the ones who managed, against all odds, to secure legal counsel. Their stories circulate like talismans, each one a spark in the long night of institutional oppression. And perhaps the most extraordinary of them is a woman named Margaret, whose case would later become one of the most cited examples in the movement for reform. Margaret had been educated, articulate, and painfully aware of the legal mechanisms that entrapped her. Her husband, frustrated by her unwillingness to relinquish control over her inheritance, spun a narrative of instability that two obliging doctors endorsed without serious examination. Once inside, she observed everything with forensic precision: the ledger entries, the staff rotations, the discrepancies between official schedules and actual practices. She noted which women were confined for so-called delusions that were, in truth, ordinary expressions of fear or anger. She recorded the ways punishment was disguised as treatment. Most dangerously of all, she found a way to smuggle her observations into the outside world through a sympathetic laundress who delivered linens to the town. Those writings eventually reached a solicitor with an interest in psychiatric law. He was young, ambitious, and skeptical of the expanding power of asylum administrators. Margaret's detailed account provided exactly the ammunition he needed. He filed a petition on her behalf, challenging not only her confinement, but the very statute that allowed husbands to authorize such confinement so easily. The case drew public attention precisely because it questioned an assumption so deeply rooted in British society that few had ever interrogated it, that a husband's authority over his wife was natural, rational, and legally sound. The hearings that followed did not immediately dismantle the system, but they did force the courts to acknowledge that the existing law placed extraordinary power in the hands of men without providing women any meaningful recourse. The case sparked outrage among reformers and nervous murmurs among conservatives who feared that altering the law would undermine the sanctity of marriage. But it also emboldened other women who had previously believed their experiences were isolated. They came forward with testimonies, some whispered, some written anonymously, some spoken aloud for the first time. Each account added weight to the growing argument that the law was not merely flawed, but fundamentally unjust. As public scrutiny intensified, Parliament could no longer rely on silence to protect the status quo. And yet, inside the asylum, life continued as before. You still woke to the clang of the morning bell. You still folded linens until your knuckles cracked. You still learned to read a nurse's mood from the angle of her shoulders. The notion that lawmakers might be debating the legitimacy of your confinement seemed unreal, almost laughable. It belonged to a world that felt inaccessible, a world where your husband's word was not a sentence carved into your fate. You had learned painfully that institutions do not change from within. They change when the outside world forces them to. And even then, the change is slow, uneven, resisted at every step by those who benefit from the existing order. But even as debates intensified beyond the gates, the institution maintained its grip on you with the same cold efficiency it had always shown, and you began to realize that the greatest power it wielded was not physical but psychological. It taught you, day by day, that resistance was futile, that hope was impractical, that your past life was a dream you had foolishly believed in. You felt the edges of your identity blur until you could barely distinguish your own thoughts from the routines imposed upon you. Some days you woke with the sense that you were falling into yourself, sinking towards an emptiness shaped by other people's decisions. And on those days, you understood why so many women left this place not cured but hollowed out, their former selves sealed behind the gates forever. The administrators spoke often of order, of stability, of the necessity of discipline in maintaining a safe environment. Yet their version of safety was a strange one, a safety that required compliance, silence, and the erasure of anything resembling personal agency. Wives were rendered patients, not because they were ill, but because their subordination was considered essential to the functioning of the household, the community, the nation. A woman who refused to obey, who insisted on her own thoughts, her own desires, her own dignity, could be categorized as unstable with a few strokes of a pen. And once committed, she entered a world where those strokes dictated the terms of her existence. One of the nurses once told you that the saddest cases were not the women who screamed or argued or fought their confinement, but the ones who adapted too well, the ones who learned to smile at the right moments, to apologize for invented faults, to keep their eyes lowered and their voices soft. She said these women frightened her because they had replaced their true selves with the behaviors demanded of them. They had become the ideal patients, obedient, quiet, compliant. But beneath that compliance was a desolation deeper than any diagnosis could articulate. These were the women who did not need to be locked inside. Their imprisonment had followed them inward, settling into their minds like sediment. The more you observed, the clearer it became that the institution operated not as a place of healing, but as a mechanism for preserving social order. Doctors spoke with the assurance of men who believed they were protecting civilization from instability. The law gave them the authority to determine who was sane and who was dangerous. And husbands used that authority to maintain control in marriages built on power rather than affection. The asylum was the perfect solution to the anxieties of a society afraid of women who stepped outside prescribed roles. It offered the illusion of medical legitimacy while reinforcing the belief that male authority was natural, unquestionable, and necessary. But despite the institution's efforts to control every aspect of your life, fractures slowly began to appear within its walls. Margaret's case had become a topic of discussion among nurses, whispered with a mixture of admiration and fear. Some spoke of other women who might have grounds to challenge their confinement. A few staff members expressed discomfort with the idea that healing could be imposed by force. And there were rumors, persistent, unsettling rumors, that members of Parliament were visiting asylums in secret, gathering information for potential reforms. These rumors carried a strange weight, a suggestion that the outside world was no longer willing to accept the unquestioned authority of asylum administrators. Still, change did not come quickly. Bureaucracies cling to their structures with desperate tenacity, and this institution was no exception. For every reformer demanding oversight, there were officials defending the status quo. They insisted that husbands knew their wives better than anyone else, that medical professionals were impartial, that women were too emotional to judge their own mental states accurately. They used language crafted to sound reasonable, but it masked a truth that was becoming harder to ignore, that the asylum system was less about protection and more about control. Some women were released, but many more remained, and even when they were allowed to leave, the damage lingered. Their reputations were stained by their time inside, their words treated with suspicion, their futures limited by the stigma of institutionalization. A husband could ruin a wife with a single signature, but no signature could restore what the institution had taken from her. Freedom, once broken, did not return whole. As the 20th century approached, the tide of public opinion slowly, painfully, began to turn. Investigations revealed cases of wrongful confinement. Journalists published accounts of overcrowded wards and abusive treatments. Reformers demanded accountability, calling for stricter regulations and independent reviews. And in Parliament, voices rose against the laws that granted husbands such disproportionate power. These efforts eventually culminated in revisions to the lunacy statutes, narrowing the circumstances under which a wife could be committed and requiring additional oversight. The reforms did not dismantle the system entirely, but they introduced the first cracks in its foundations. Yet for those who had lived through the old regime, the reforms were too late to undo the harm already done. Women who had lost decades within asylum walls emerged into a world that no longer recognized them. Their children had grown, their husbands had remarried or died, their communities had forgotten them. The institutions that had consumed their lives recorded their histories in ledgers that reduced them to symptoms and behaviors, never acknowledging the injustice of their confinement. And while the walls of some asylums eventually fell, the legacy of those institutions remained embedded in the landscape of British society. You realize as you stand on the threshold of release that the greatest cruelty was not the confinement itself, but the erasure that accompanied it. You were removed from the world, not because you were dangerous, but because your presence disrupted a fragile social order built on obedience and silence. The law allowed it, the doctors justified it, the staff enforced it, and the community accepted it. The institution did not need to kill you to destroy you. It only needed to make you disappear until the idea of your existence faded from the memory of those who had once known you. When you step outside the gates at last, the air feels unfamiliar, sharp with the scent of a world that moved on without you. You carry with you the weight of years that cannot be recovered, and the knowledge that countless women before you and after you suffered the same fate. You walk forward because there is nothing else you can do, but you know that the institution's shadow will accompany you always. You know that the law may change, but the impulse to control those who threaten established norms persists in new forms, disguised under new names. And that is the truth most people prefer not to confront, that systems of power rarely vanish. They evolve, they adapt, they find new justifications and new structures, but their core remains the same. They survive because societies allow them to, because people look away until the harm becomes undeniable. The asylum was one such system, respectable, legal, efficient, and it consumed women not through violence but through a slow, deliberate erasure of identity. The question that lingers, whispered across generations, is whether we have truly dismantled such systems or merely renamed them, whether the mechanisms of control have been eliminated or simply relocated, whether the silence that once swallowed women inside asylums has resurfaced in other institutions, softened by modern language but driven by the same ancient fear of those who refuse to be small. History suggests that vigilance is the only barrier between justice and repetition, and if this story leaves you unsettled, it is because the past is not finished with us. Its machinery still exists, in policies, in prejudices, in the quiet spaces where decisions are made without those who will bear their consequences. The institution may be gone, but its logic still breathes.